Afternoon, sophomores and Toby. I am going to give the lecture for the chapter 27, which is talking about Jesus' conflicts with the Pharisees. He had a series of, during this last week of his life, a series of interchanges, generally in the temple, with Jewish leaders, with different groups of Jewish leaders. So we're going to talk about that. And let's open with a word of prayer. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for these students. Thank you for the truth of your word as we walk through these interchanges that Jesus has with different groups of people. I pray that we would desire to find our answers in him. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. So these interchanges are sort of a matching of the wits between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and Jesus. I'll let you guess who wins that matching of the wits. It's not even close. So we're going to walk through 4 questions that were posed to Jesus in this last week of his life. Now, your book gives these timelines, and as I've mentioned before, I disagree with the timelines. We'll talk about that more in a bit. And then it also places what we've already studied in John 12, 1 through 8, the anointing of Jesus at Bethany, later in the week than John does. They said that John placed it out of chronological order. I don't believe that is true. It says in the actual story, 6 days before Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany and this happened. So I think when we get to the end of the story, I'll talk about that just a little bit. But we won't go through it again in detail in any way because we already have. So we won't go through that again. So I am going to show you these, and mostly, or show you this slide, mostly just to remind you that your curriculum takes the minority view that Jesus died on Thursday, not on Friday. Why? Why do they take that? I don't know if I've explained that to you. Mostly, people who take this view are doing so because Jesus is the Passover lamb. And so they believe that the Passover lamb, that Jesus would have made the sacrifice at the time that the lambs were being sacrificed at the temple. And in this case, that actually would have been Thursday when that was happening. But the Passover was still ongoing, or at least the Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was all kind of referred to as the Passover. It was still ongoing on Friday, so and Saturday and Sunday. So I don't think that is reason enough for us to think that it happened on that the crucifixion happened on Thursday. And you can see that on Thursday it says Jesus' crucifixion, death on Golgotha, and his burial. And then Friday and Saturday are blank, and then Sunday is the resurrection. I've also told you many times that on the third day would be Friday to Sunday, because in Jewish reckoning, the first day was the day that something happened. In this case, the crucifixion of Jesus on Friday, the first day, Saturday, the second day, and on the third day, Sunday, Jesus rose. These other things are, other than the triumphal entry, what's happening on Monday and some of what's happening on Tuesday, probably happened on Monday and Tuesday, although you see it says Jesus anointed at Bethany, and that was the Friday before. The Saturday, Friday or Saturday before that, 6 days, Saturday would have been 6 days before Passover. So I just show you this, it's in your book. Don't worry about this. These sorts of questions, like what day of the week did Jesus die, that's not going to be on a test. I just wanted to mention it to you before we move on. So, here we go with these questions. And by the way, Jesus would go to Jerusalem during Holy Week. He would go to Jerusalem during the day, and then he'd go back to Bethany to spend the night. He'd go over the Mount of Olives and return to Bethany. This says that we're looking at the events of Tuesday, Nisan 12. Well, again, as I told you, some of these maybe were on Tuesday, but we don't know for sure, and some of them probably weren't on Tuesday. So you can amend this. I can't change the slide, but if I would suggest that that you write some events of Holy Week. Because this all happens during Holy Week. So some of the events during Holy Week. And we're specifically going to be looking at questions that were posed to Jesus during this time. So we're just going to call these events of Holy Week. So the different groups of people, different groups of Jewish leaders come to Jesus and ask him questions. And in asking these questions, they're trying to trip him up. They're testing him. They're trying to get him to say something that he shouldn't say. Excuse me. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. That was just a little cough or something in my throat. So what they were doing was, if he failed to answer these questions correctly, or correctly in their mind, they might have reason to bring a charge against him. They might have reason to accuse him of something in order to get him out of the way. Hopefully something in their minds that was deserving death. So we're going to look at each of these four questions. We're going to begin in Matthew 21. And this first question is a question about Christ's authority. Do you have the authority to do what you're doing? So here's the question posed of Jesus, beginning at verse 23. And when he entered the temple, meaning when Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" Now, by what authority do you do these things? Those things included his teaching, his miracles, so both his sayings, so both what he said and what he did. By whose authority do you heal people? By whose authority do you teach people? And they thought they had Jesus trapped. There's the answer there. And they thought they had Jesus trapped, but his answer confounds them. Here's what he says. Jesus answered them, "I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I also will tell you by what authority I do these things." So you answer my question, and I'll answer yours, is what Jesus is saying. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man? So his question is this: was John's ministry and John's baptism from God or not? Now, this put the Pharisees on the horns of a dilemma, as they say, because the people loved John. And the people saw John as some sort of prophet. I mean, they asked him, "Who are you?" And they thought maybe he might be Elijah, he might be a prophet, he might be the Messiah. They were very in favor of John and his ministry. So if they say it's of men, that it's not of God, the people are going to turn against them, might even riot, because they're going to be angry that the Pharisees are not supporting John's ministry. But if they say it's of God, that it's from heaven, then why didn't they believe him? Why didn't they become followers? That doesn't make sense. So they can't really answer one way or another. And what do you do when you can't answer one way or another? And they discussed it among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say to us, "Why then did you not believe him?" But if we say from man, we are afraid of the crowd, that they will hold that John, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know," which is what you answer when you don't want to answer, or you don't know the answer. They believed it was from man, but they knew they couldn't say that. So they say, "We don't know." And he said to them, neither will I. So Jesus said back to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. You didn't answer my question. And so I won't answer yours. Here's what the Pharisees and everyone else that we'll talk about today, here's what they didn't understand. They were arguing with God in the flesh. A smart thing to do, right? They were arguing with God. People try to do that sometimes. It doesn't work out very well. It's foolish to argue with God. Our former pastor, he retired a few years ago, but years and years ago, he gave a sermon I've never forgotten. And it was on the dangers of arguing with God. And so and it scared me. And whenever I get close to a point or believe that I'm starting to argue with God, I remember that sermon because it is a dangerous thing to argue with God. He will work his will out. He will do what he purposes to do, no matter whether you choose to do the right thing or I choose to do the right thing or not. I know you've heard the story of how I came to be the Bible teacher at Cornerstone. Some of you had me as an elementary PE teacher, and that was kind of my entree. At that point, I was just like, I got nothing better to do. My kids are all out of the house and in school or in college, and so I might as well earn some money now. I'm not homeschooling anyone anymore. And so when Mrs. Schraub called and asked me to teach elementary PE, I said yes, which led to me actually really enjoying teaching elementary PE. I wanted to keep doing it, so I had to get my license back. And so in the process of doing that, I had to student teach. I called myself the world's oldest student teacher. And so I decided to do that. Now, here's the thing. Right about the time, just before I started to student, not just before, probably I student taught in like April. So like the November before, God said to me, it's time for you to lay down Bible study. As you know, I wrote and taught Bible studies for the women at my church for 13 years, and I loved doing it, and it was fulfilling to me. I thought I hadn't heard from God, because God wouldn't say that, right? I mean, no, surely He wouldn't ask me to lay down Bible study, to stop doing that. And so He kept coming back with that, and I kept pushing back on it a little bit, like, do you know how many women attend this? Do you know how long I've done this? Do you know how this blesses me? And at least if the women are lying to me, that blesses them. And in December, I realized I'm arguing with God. And what I sensed Him saying was that He had something for me, and I couldn't say yes to that until I said no to Bible study. And so in January, when Bible study started up again, I told my ladies I was quitting. And it was that I was arguing with God, that the realization that I was arguing with God was one of the biggest factors in my submitting to what God had for me. Well, before my 3 weeks of student teaching was up, I had an offer to teach full-time at Cornerstone, teaching, as some of your older siblings know, teaching social studies and English to 7th and 8th graders. I did that for a year before they asked me to become their Bible teacher. And that 13 years of writing and teaching Bible studies is what qualifies me to be your Bible teacher. What if I would have argued? What if I would have refused to do what God wanted me to do? Look, God was going to do what He purposed to do. But I would have lost out on the blessing it is to teach Bible at Cornerstone. And I'm so grateful I didn't. So this is an aside, and it was a long aside. Don't argue. It doesn't turn out well when we do. So the first question was on Christ's authority. The second question had to do with taxes. Now, the Romans collected taxes from the Jewish people. Of course, the Romans ruled Judea, ruled Palestine, and so they had the right to exact taxes from them. But the Jews hated this. And so two groups of people are going to come together to ask this question. These verses are going to tell us that the Pharisees and the Herodians came together to Jesus. Odd coupling. We'll talk about that as soon as I read the question. The tribes and the chief... Is that where I'm supposed to be? Yeah. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something. He said so to deliver him up to the authority and the jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute, taxes, to Caesar or not? So these groups, and I know it says the scribes and the teachers, that's why I kind of hesitated there for a minute. But these two groups of people, the Pharisees and the Herodians, they didn't like each other. The Pharisees were the religious leaders of the entire land. The Herodians were those that had aligned themselves to Herod, and Herod was basically unreligious. He was supposed to be Jewish, but he really didn't care about the Jewish faith. And so the Pharisees hated the Herodians because they were, in their minds, apostate Jews. The Herodians didn't like the Pharisees because they made them feel guilty about that. So they come together and they ask this question: Is it lawful? Is it okay for us to pay these taxes? Now the people hated paying the taxes, and they hated the Herodians because the Herodians were, in cahoots, a word we used to use, with the Romans. But they had this shared hatred of Christ, and so they were willing to put those differences aside to ask him this question. So here's the problem. If Jesus says, yes, pay the taxes, he's going to anger the Pharisees and the religious Jews. If he says, no, don't pay the taxes, he's going to anger Herod and the tax collectors who are becoming wealthy off those taxes, and the Romans. So either way, he's in trouble, or at least they think he's in trouble. And so here's his answer. But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, show me a denarius, which is like saying, show me a quarter, show me a coin. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. He said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. So he asks them to get him a coin, and they produce one. They have Roman coins in their pockets. What does that say about them? We'll get to that in just a minute. And so he says, whose picture's on there? And they say, Caesar's. And then he explains to them that their responsibility towards Caesar is only in material matters. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, a coin, in material matters. But to give to God that which is his, and that is our spiritual concern. The Jews understood exactly what he was saying. And in fact, in that time, to accept the coinage and to use the coinage of any king was essentially to say, this is our king. We are citizens of the United States. And so we use coins and we use bills that say, this is the United States. The United States governs over us. And that's true of every country. That by using that, you're saying, this is the people to whom I belong. So the fact that when Jesus said, "Give me a denarius," they reached into their pockets and gave him, meant that they were tacitly, not implicitly, both words that you might need to look up, but they're good words, saying that Caesar was their king. Caesar was the one in control. And so he answers just by saying, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God," and our hearts are to belong to God. So then the Sadducees are up next, and they're going to talk about the resurrection. Now, I think we've talked about the Sadducees before, and that the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, which is why they were so Sadducee. There's your darn for today, since you're missing a quarter's worth of darns. I know you're heartbroken about that. And so here's the question that the Sadducees ask of him. There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection. Now, let me explain that just briefly. The Jews believe that there will come a day at the end of time when everyone will rise bodily and be judged. It's very similar to what Christians believe. But this would have been before officially the start of Christianity, because Jesus is still alive and on earth. And so the Sadducees are saying, nope, when you die, and maybe your spirit goes somewhere, but there's no such thing as a physical resurrection. So that's what they're going to ask their question about. So they're doing two things. They're trying to get Jesus to say something he shouldn't say, but that he's give him a hard question that he can't answer. But they're also trying to get him to prove or to say that there is no resurrection, to back them on that. So here's how it goes. And they asked him a question saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." This is a thing called levirate marriage. Here, I'll write it out for you. Levirate marriage, and it's all over the Old Testament. And it was an Old Testament law. In levirate marriage, you see this actually in Esther and elsewhere, but not Esther, in Ruth and elsewhere. But in levirate marriage, the idea of having heirs was very important in Judaism and really in ancient cultures, especially having sons who could pass along the name. And so if a man married a woman and the man died, but they had not yet had children, it was an obligation of his brother to take this woman as his wife so that they might create heirs that would be the heirs actually of the dead brother. And so it was a way of getting heirs in the name of the brother. That's how important it was to them. So that's the situation they're talking about. A guy dies and he's married, but they haven't had children. So then he's going to marry the brother, because it's the brother's obligation then to marry the woman to give children for his brother. So that's what it's saying there, that Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. The two of them will have children, but they will be the brother's children. I know it's weird. Just go with it. This is what they all believe. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children. And the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 have her as wife. So this woman marries someone, he dies without kids, marries his first brother, same thing, second brother, same thing, third brother, fourth brother, fifth brother, sixth brother, seventh brother. They all marry her and die before they have children. Now, first of all, she's a bad bet. I had somewhere around, brother 3 or 4, they should have said, man, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to touch that. But this is obviously not a real question. It's not a real situation. They're just like making it crazy outlandish to make it even harder on Jesus, or so they think. So then when she dies, And they say in the resurrection, which they don't believe in. Like they're like, right, there's going to be a resurrection. So hoping that he would say, well, there's not going to be a resurrection, so it doesn't matter. So whose wife is she going to be in heaven? Which of the seven? I don't think any of them want her because of this situation. But which of the seven will be her husband? And so Jesus answers, and actually he could have just said, I'm not going to dignify that silly question with an answer. But he does answer it. And he answers it very wisely. He says this, and Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. On this earth, we get married. Not all of us do, but many people get married. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. He doesn't mean that only unmarried people go to heaven. He's saying in heaven, there's no need for marriage. For they cannot die anymore because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So here's what Jesus is saying. And I know married people who really don't like this. They want to be married in heaven. And there's a part of me that feels that way too. But this is Jesus' teaching, that marriage is no longer necessary in heaven. And so he's saying that in the resurrection, which he's saying to them, there is a resurrection of the dead. He's saying that the Pharisees are right and you're wrong. In the resurrection, there's no longer a need for marriage. Why? Because we will be so consumed by our adoration and love for God. He will be all that we need. We won't need marriage to fulfill us or to procreate or for happiness. God will provide everything we need. There'll be no more pain and no more sorrow and no more crying anymore. And so there is not marriage. Now, do I think in heaven, do I think we'll know each other and we'll recognize one another and we'll relate to one another? Absolutely. But our focus won't be other people. Our focus will be on Christ, on God. I don't think I put it. Yeah. So So this is how he proves that answer is right to them. So he says this, but that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and Isaac, and the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Then some of the scribes, I'll come back to that in a minute. Here's what he's saying. He says that God is the God of Abraham. God is the God of Isaac. God is the God of Jacob. Still, they must be alive. He doesn't say God was the God of Abraham. Abraham's dead and going to stay dead. No, he's alive. And so this is his proof that there is no need for marriage, but also that there is a resurrection, that God is the God of those who have died on this earth. He is the God of Abraham. He is still the God of Abraham because they are still living. For God to be still the God of Abraham must mean that Abraham is still living. So that is something they can't refute because he's using scripture. He's quoting scripture, which they believe in. And so they say, "Teacher, you have spoken well." For they no longer dared to ask him any questions. They were now afraid to ask him any more questions. And now we have another group that comes to see him, and they're going to ask Christ about the commandments and what is the greatest commandment. So here's the question in verse 28. And one of the scribes were teachers of the law, lawyers essentially, but teachers of the law. They were experts in the law. So they taught the law to the people. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, that Jesus answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? Listen, I think this scribe was sincere. I don't think he was trying to catch Jesus in anything. I don't think he was sent there. I think this was going on, and he sees it, and he's like, man, this dude's giving great answers. I want to know what he thinks is the greatest commandment of all. I think he's sincere. I could be wrong about that. It doesn't tell us one way or the other. But I think that that's probably the case. And he asks, what's the greatest commandment? And here's Jesus' answer. Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Okay, this, I think I've mentioned before, is in Deuteronomy 6. This is the most important, most holy commandment of Judaism. It is called the Shema, which comes from the Hebrew meaning hear. That is the most important and greatest commandment, to love God with all that we have, to love God with all that we are. And so he's quoting from Deuteronomy here. So hear, O Israel, the Lord. So all of God's people hear this. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And then he says the second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. There's nothing we can do that's more important than to love God and to love other people, to love God with all that we are and all that we have, and to love our neighbor as ourselves, to love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. Those are the two most important commandments. And then this was the answer that the scribe gave him. And the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one and there is no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared ask him any questions anymore. And so this man sees that Jesus has answered correctly, that Jesus has answered rightly, and is impressed by that. Love the Lord your God with all that you have and with all that you are. And love others as yourself. I think it was Augustine, but Augustine gets credited with a lot of quotes. But I think it was Augustine that said, love God and then do as you please. Now, here's what that's not saying. Love God and you can live anyway. Do whatever you want. If you really love God, you will want to do what he wants you to do. You will want to live in a way that honors him because you love him. I used to think about the psalm that says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will grant you the desires of your heart. And I used to think, okay, well, the desire of my heart, this is when I was young and single, like college age, just after. The desire of my heart is a husband. So how do I do this delight myself in the Lord thing? How do I get that down? Because if I get the delighting myself in the Lord thing, then he'll give me a husband. That's not what that means. If I'm delighting myself in the Lord, if I'm loving God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, then what I desire will be what he desires for me. My desires will be his desires. And I think that's a lot of what Jesus is saying here as well. So now at the end, Jesus takes the initiative. For being confronted by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians and the scribes, Jesus reveals some things about them. They're trying to reveal something about Jesus and trying to reveal that he's an imposter or worthy of death. But in fact, it is Jesus who reveals something about his questioners. The first thing that he reveals is their ignorance. They didn't understand who he was. They didn't understand the point. They didn't get what he was trying to do and trying to say. And yet, it tells us at the end of Mark 12 that the great throng, the people, heard him gladly. They loved what they heard, especially because they were taking on the Jewish establishment that and the people that had them under their thumb. And so it was revealing their ignorance. And he also revealed their hypocrisy. That while they were holding Jesus to this high standard, they were holding themselves to a much lower standard. To no standard, really. They were in charge, and they could do whatever they wanted. You've got to do what we tell you to do. We can do whatever we want. That's the worst kind of leadership. My dad, when he was at Offutt the last time, he was chief of staff of SAC. And one of his duties was to assign the generals aboard Looking Glass. Looking Glass is no longer true of Looking Glass, but it was a plane, a spy plane that was in the air 24/7, 365 or 66, depending on the year, days a year. A Looking Glass plane would take off before the one before it landed, so that there was always a plane in the air that was making sure we were safe, that was checking what was going on in the world and being able to get a jump on anything horrible like nuclear war. And there always had to be a general on board, because if in the case of a nuclear war, and if in the case that our government was taken out, that general on board that Looking Glass plane would be the person in charge. My dad always scheduled himself for Christmas Day, Thanksgiving Day, New Year's Eve, days when people would want to be home with their families. And even as a 7th and 8th grader, I understood why Daddy was doing that. And I remember my father telling me, I don't want to ask anyone to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. That's servant leadership. The Pharisees weren't that way. They believed the people were there to serve them, not them to serve them. God's economy, the way it's supposed to be, maybe servant leaders, runs counterintuitive to the world's economy. The world says, I'm in charge, you obey me. And Jesus says, I'm in charge. I'm going to lay down my life for you. That's true servant leadership. These leaders were ignorant and they were hypocritical. You know, you probably know this, but Jesus reserved his most scathing, his most harsh condemnation for the Jewish leaders of his day. He denounced them many times using harsh language. He called them hypocrites and blind guides and fools and whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones and serpents and murderers and a brood of vipers. Wow, that's not nice things to tell someone. Have you ever wondered why? Why was he so harsh? Here's why. In the most important arena of life, the arena of faith, the arena of what are we going to do with Jesus? What are we going to do with God? Are we going to place our faith in them or not? They were misleading the people. They were leading the people to hell. And Jesus was working in his ministry to stop that. And ultimately, he would give his life to overcome that as well, so that people would not be misled, but they might be led to him. Now, we're going to talk real quickly about the anointing at Bethany. The only reason I'm doing this, because we've already talked about it, but there may be a question on a quiz that is one of these blanks, so I want to make sure you have the blanks filled in. The picture you're looking at is modern day Jerusalem, taken from the Mount of Olives, and you can see where this Dome of the Rock mosque stands now. That was where the temple stood, just across the Kidron Valley from the Mount of Olives. You can see the olive trees, vines, whatever, there as well. And so he arrives in Bethany, and you know the passage. I won't read it again. That he has dinner at the house of Simon the leper, who may not have been related to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Martha breaks this jar of pure nard and anoints Jesus with it. John talks about his feet being anointed, but likely his whole body was anointed. This is a typical house, and it's showing you how people would lie down. They'd lie down on their left side and eat with their right hand. So when it says they reclined at table, the tables were low and there were cushions, and so they'd be kind of lying down on their elbow as they ate. And so what this teaches us about Mary's act and how we can apply that to our lives is this. This was the act of one who truly loves the Lord. So that first space there is saying the word is act. The act of one who truly loved the Lord. We talked about the lavishness of what was going on here, the lavishness of the gift that Mary brought to Jesus. And then secondly, the attitude of one who pretends to love the Lord. That's not Mary. That's Judas. So this story shows us not only the act that shows love to Jesus, but also the attitude of one who pretended to, Judas, saying, she should have sold this and given it to the poor, when he really just wanted to steal the money from the purse that he kept for the disciples. That'd be a question I'd have for Jesus someday. Why did you let Judas steal the money? But that's a story for another day, I guess. And then the answer of Jesus. He knows men's heart. He not only knew Judas's heart, but he knew Mary's heart. And he knows our hearts as well. And so that can be sometimes comforting and sometimes scary that he does. But he does know our hearts as well. So that is the lecture for this chapter. I think I said in the homework notes that just watch it a half hour at a time. This is going to be probably a 40-ish minute lecture. So you don't have to watch it all in one day. That's the silly thing to say at the end. But anyway, I hope you all had a happy Easter. We're coming up on studying the Passion Week, and we are studying the Passion Week, Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. It's always an exciting time of year to do that. I miss you. I will miss you until the day you're back here in this classroom.